Claire, Ethan, and Evelyn seemed like a family bound by love, but behind the walls of their quiet home lived a scandal darker than anyone could imagine. Ethan was Claire's devoted husband. Evelyn was her trusted mother, yet their secret affair shattered every bond of trust. When Evelyn became pregnant with Ethan's child, betrayal cut deeper than blood, and the twisted love triangle spiraled into obsession, deceit, and finally, brutal violence. What began as a forbidden romance turned into one of the most shocking true crime stories of all time, where family loyalty was destroyed and vengeance left nothing but tragedy in its wake. Ethan and Claire lived in a suburban neighborhood where every house looked almost identical, lined neatly in rows with manicured lawns and trimmed hedges. To outsiders, their life seemed ideal. They were the kind of couple who looked steady, with years of marriage behind them, a comfortable home, and a routine that gave the impression of stability. Ethan worked tirelessly on his small but growing business, and Claire took care of the house with dedication. They had no children, but that never seemed to raise concern among friends and neighbors. They were seen as a couple that had built their life together brick by brick. Yet beneath this calm surface, a storm was waiting to break, and the seeds of destruction were already quietly sprouting inside their home. The shift began when Evelyn, Claire's mother, moved in with them. Evelyn was a woman who carried herself with elegance even though she was well into her 50s. After separating from her husband, she needed a place to stay, and Claire, wanting to support her, insisted that she live with them. At first, the arrangement appeared harmless. Evelyn helped with cooking, cleaning, and gave the house a liveliness it had lacked. She was warm, social, and never seemed to run out of energy. To Claire, her mother's presence was a blessing. But for Ethan, it was something far more complicated. Ethan had always noticed Evelyn's striking looks, though he never admitted it, not even to himself. There was a confidence in the way she carried herself, a presence that was difficult to ignore. She had a wit sharper than most, and her eyes carried a mischievous spark that made it impossible to look away. For Ethan, who felt the weight of routine and the growing dullness in his marriage, Evelyn's charm felt intoxicating. It wasn't immediate, but slowly he began to find himself lingering around her, listening more carefully to her words, watching her closely when she wasn't looking. At first, Ethan dismissed it as nothing more than idle attraction, a fleeting thought that didn't matter. But what begins as harmless often grows dangerous when left unchecked. Evelyn, too, began noticing Ethan's attention. She wasn't T-blind to the way he looked at her or how his voice subtly changed when he spoke to her. Part of her enjoyed it. Having recently separated, she craved attention, validation, and a reminder that she was still desired. Ethan gave her that without even realizing how deeply he was feeding into her need. What started as long conversations in the kitchen after Claire went to bed became the foundation for something riskier. They began to share secrets, little details about their lives that they never told anyone else. Their words carried a weight, binding them together in a dangerous web. Soon, the conversations turned into subtle touches, a hand on the shoulder, a glance that lingered longer than it should. The tension between them grew thicker each day until it was impossible to ignore. Neither Ethan nor Evelyn planned for it to happen. One evening, when Claire was away visiting a friend, they found themselves alone in the house. What began as casual talk spiraled into something they both knew was wrong but couldn't resist. They told themselves it was just a mistake, a one-time slip that would never happen again. But the adrenaline, the secrecy, and the forbidden nature of it made it even more intoxicating. That one night turned into another, and then another, until it became an unspoken routine. Ethan's guilt was heavy, but the desire overpowered it. Each time he swore to himself it would be the last, he found himself pulled back in. Evelyn, too, carried her shame but felt alive in ways she hadn't in years. She told herself that she was simply enjoying attention that she had been denied in her failed marriage. Both of them justified it in their own ways, weaving excuses in their minds to make sense of something they knew was unspeakable. Claire, trusting and unaware, saw nothing unusual. She believed her husband and her mother were getting along well, which brought her comfort. She never suspected that behind closed doors, betrayal was taking root. Evelyn and Ethan became skilled at hiding their actions, careful with their timing. careful with their words and cautious about leaving any trace. Yet no matter how carefully they planned, the truth had a way of pressing against the surface, threatening to break through. Every stolen moment came with risk, and that risk only made it more thrilling for Ethan. He convinced himself that nobody would ever find out, that as long as they were careful, the secret would remain safe. Evelyn thought the same, believing that the secrecy itself protected them. But passion is rarely patient, and secrets rarely stay buried for long. The connection between them grew deeper, stronger, and harder to control. Soon, the affair was no longer just about desire. It became emotional, almost like a twisted relationship running parallel to Ethan's marriage. He began comparing Evelyn to Claire, and Evelyn began imagining what it would be like if Ethan had been hers all along. They didn't speak those thoughts aloud, but they existed, lingering in the air every time they were together. What they started couldn't simply end. It was growing into something bigger than both of them, something that would eventually demand a price neither was prepared to pay. In the silence of the house at night, when Claire was asleep, Evelyn and Ethan would steal glances across the room, knowing exactly what they both wanted but pretending innocence in her presence. Their secret world was expanding, and with it came the inevitable weight of consequences waiting to strike. The foundation of betrayal was firmly laid, and every day it grew stronger, weaving itself into their lives like a shadow they couldn't escape. Neither of them realized that the choices they were making were not temporary. What began as stolen passion would soon spiral into something darker, something that would tear apart not just a marriage, but an entire family. They thought they were in control, but the truth was that the secret was already controlling them. The affair between Ethan and Evelyn grew heavier with each passing day, but what had started as fleeting passion now carried consequences that neither of them could ignore. Evelyn began to sense changes in her body, small signs that something was different, and though she tried to dismiss them at first, the truth could not be denied. A test confirmed what she feared most: she was pregnant. The shock left her paralyzed. At her age, she had never imagined she would be in this position again, and certainly not under such circumstances. The father of the child was her daughter's husband, and there was no way to disguise the gravity of what had happened. Ethan's reaction was one of panic. The news struck him like a blow he could not recover from. He paced through sleepless nights, his mind spiraling with questions and scenarios. How could they possibly hide this? What excuse could they ever create that would keep Claire from discovering the truth? A pregnancy was not something that could be erased by lies or ignored until it went away. It was a living, undeniable symbol of betrayal, and it would eventually demand to be acknowledged. The walls of secrecy they had so carefully built were now crumbling, and he felt powerless to stop it. Evelyn wrestled with her own turmoil. Part of her wanted to deny the truth, to pretend that she could continue on as if nothing had changed. Yet every day, as the symptoms grew stronger, so did her awareness of what was happening inside her. She thought about ending it before anyone could find out, but fear and hesitation held her back. Another part of her felt strangely protective of the life that had begun, even though she knew it was born of shame and betrayal. The conflict gnawed at her, pulling her in opposite directions until she could barely think straight. For Ethan, the pregnancy meant the collapse of everything he had built. He knew that if Claire discovered the truth, their marriage would be over, but it would go beyond that. His reputation in the community, his business, even his friendships would be destroyed. The scandal would follow him everywhere, a stain that could never be erased. He tried to convince Evelyn that the problem could be solved quietly, that they could make it disappear before anyone noticed. But Evelyn resisted, torn between guilt and an unexpected attachment to the unborn child. The atmosphere in the house grew suffocating. Ethan's nervousness became more visible as he grew impatient with even the smallest things. He found it harder to look Claire in the eye, and when he did, guilt twisted in his stomach. Evelyn, too, began to withdraw, spending more time alone, offering vague excuses whenever Claire asked why she seemed distant. These small cracks began to show, but Claire, still trusting, did not yet put the pieces together. She noticed tension but assumed it was simply stress. Her mother was adjusting to her new life, and Ethan was carrying the weight of his business. She had no idea of the secret tying them together. As the weeks passed, hiding Evelyn's condition became harder. Loose clothing and careful excuses could only conceal so much, and her body was slowly betraying her. She avoided social gatherings, avoided anyone who might notice changes, but inside the house, the strain was unbearable. Ethan grew desperate, pleading with her to take action before it was too late, but Evelyn remained undecided. The weight of the decision crushed her, and her hesitation pushed Ethan deeper into paranoia. The more Ethan panicked, the more careless he became. He would snap at Claire without reason, disappear for hours under the excuse of work, and hover too closely over Evelyn's choices. His behavior drew questions, and though Claire didn't yet see the full truth, her suspicions began to grow. She felt something was wrong, though she couldn't identify what it was. That unease only deepened when she noticed her mother's subtle changes. The quiet way Evelyn avoided certain topics, the fatigue that seemed to weigh her down. The silence between Ethan and Evelyn became louder than any confession. They spoke less in front of Claire, terrified that even their words might give them away. When they were alone, their conversations were no longer filled with stolen passion, but with fear, arguments, and desperate planning. Every option they considered came with risks. If Evelyn continued with the pregnancy, the truth would inevitably be revealed. If she chose another path, they would carry the burden of what they had done forever. Either way, the future looked like a dead end. The pressure pushed Ethan into darker thoughts. He began to consider ways of controlling the situation that went beyond reason. His fear of exposure consumed him to the point where he imagined drastic measures, anything that might silence the threat before it destroyed his life. But Evelyn was not as easily persuaded. Despite the guilt, she clung to the child growing inside her, even though it was the result of betrayal. The thought of erasing it filled her with dread. This conflict between them created a fracture in their secret bond. What had once united them now began to tear them apart. As the second trimester approached, hiding Evelyn's condition was becoming impossible. She started avoiding her daughter altogether, retreating to her room or leaving the house for long stretches of time. Claire noticed the shift, and her questions grew sharper. Why was her mother acting so strangely? Why was her husband so restless, so different from the man she had known? The truth was circling closer, and Ethan could feel the walls closing in. The pregnancy was no longer a private secret. It had become a time bomb waiting to explode. Every day brought them closer to discovery, and the weight of anticipation was unbearable. Evelyn tried to maintain calm, telling herself she could still manage it, that perhaps she could find a way to shield Claire from the truth until she was ready. But Ethan no longer believed in control. His nerves were frayed, his lies tangled, and his mask of composure was slipping in ways Claire could not ignore. The house that once felt like a safe haven had turned into a cage filled with secrets, guilt, and dread. Ethan and Evelyn lived every moment in fear of exposure, their choices binding them together in ways they could never escape. The pregnancy, a symbol of their betrayal, was a shadow looming over every conversation, every glance, every silence. And though they tried to hold on to the illusion that they could manage it, the reality was already slipping through their fingers. The truth was no longer something they could hide forever. It was only a matter of time before it came crashing into the open, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. Claire began to sense the cracks forming around her without fully understanding what they meant. Her mother had become distant, retreating into herself in ways that felt unnatural. Evelyn avoided direct eye contact, often excusing herself from family meals, and spent more time locked away in her room. Claire noticed her mother's clothes growing looser, her movements slower, her fatigue more visible. At first, she assumed it was stress from the separation, perhaps even the toll of age catching up. But something about it gnawed at her, a whisper in the back of her mind that things weren't as simple as they appeared. Ethan's behavior added to her unease. He was once a man who prided himself on steadiness, who laughed easily, and who treated her with affection that felt genuine. Yet now he seemed restless, nervous, and unpredictable. His temper flared over the smallest things, and he often vanished under the excuse of late work hours. Claire tried to dismiss her suspicions, telling herself that people went through phases, that stress could change anyone. Still, the changes in both her husband and her mother felt connected, though she couldn't yet see how. One evening, Claire decided to confront Evelyn about her health. She asked directly if something was wrong, if there was an illness or worry she hadn't shared. Evelyn froze, her words stumbling as she reached for vague excuses. She claimed she was fine, just tired, but the way her eyes darted away told another story. Claire felt her unease deepen. She wanted to press harder but held back, hoping her mother would eventually open up on her own. Weeks passed, and Evelyn's condition became impossible to hide. Claire began to notice subtle swelling, the kind she had seen in friends who were expecting children. The realization struck her like a blow, though at first she dismissed it as impossible. How could her mother, at her age, be pregnant? It made no sense, yet the more she observed, the clearer the truth became. And if her mother was truly pregnant, the question that haunted Claire was even more devastating: who was the father? Claire's suspicion turned into quiet investigation. She paid closer attention to the interactions between Ethan and Evelyn, noticing things she had ignored before. A quick glance exchanged across the room, the way they avoided speaking when she entered, the tension that seemed to fill the air whenever the three of them were together. Memories resurfaced times when she thought they had simply been friendly, moments when she had brushed off odd behavior as coincidence. Now those pieces began to fit into a horrifying puzzle. The breaking point came one afternoon when Claire returned home earlier than expected. She found Evelyn in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed with tears streaming down her face. The sight pierced her heart, and without thinking, she demanded the truth. Evelyn tried to stay silent, but the weight of her guilt was too heavy. The words spilled out, fractured and painful, confirming what Claire had begun to fear. She was pregnant, and Ethan was the father. Claire felt her entire world collapse in that instant. Betrayal came at her from both sides, piercing deeper than she thought possible. The man she had trusted with her heart, the person she had built her life around, had not only been unfaithful, but had chosen the one person she thought she could never lose, her own mother. And the woman who had raised her, the person she had turned to for comfort her whole life, had destroyed that bond in the most unforgivable way. The betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was a complete shattering of family, of trust, of identity. The revelation left Claire numb. Anger, sorrow, disbelief, and disgust all churned together until she could no longer separate them. She felt like she was watching her life burn down in front of her, powerless to stop the flames. Ethan, realizing that the secret was out, tried to control the damage. He attempted to calm Claire, to explain, to frame it as a mistake born out of weakness. But no words could undo the truth. Evelyn sat silently, consumed by shame, knowing nothing she could say would erase the devastation. Claire withdrew into herself, unable to face them. She stopped speaking to Ethan except for what was necessary, and her interactions with her mother became cold and distant. Nights were sleepless, filled with racing thoughts of how her life had been stolen from her by the very people she trusted most. Rage simmered under the surface, but it didn't erupt in the way Ethan expected. Instead, Claire grew quiet, calculating, and inwardly hardened. The house that once felt warm and familiar now felt like a prison of betrayal. Every corner carried memories that twisted like knives. Every glance at Ethan or Evelyn reminded her of what they had done. Claire felt trapped, yet she knew she had to act. Divorce seemed too small a punishment, and cutting ties with her mother would not heal the wounds. The more she thought, the more she realized that what she wanted wasn't freedom, it was justice in a form only she could deliver. She began to plan quietly, carefully, making sure her actions raised no suspicion. On the surface, she carried on with her life, but inside, her thoughts grew darker with each passing day. Ethan mistook her silence for acceptance, convincing himself that perhaps she would eventually forgive him. Evelyn clung to the hope that time would dull the sharpness of the betrayal. Neither of them saw the transformation happening in Claire. The trusting wife and daughter they once knew was gone, replaced by someone who carried a storm inside her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The affair had crossed into a new stage. It was no longer a secret passion shared between two guilty people. It had become a weapon, one that had destroyed everything Claire had known. And as she sat in the quiet of her room, staring at the ceiling in the dark hours of the night, she knew there was no going back. Her path was set. The betrayal had not just broken her heart, it had created something inside her that demanded vengeance. The family that once stood together under one roof was now nothing but fractured pieces, and Claire was determined that none of them would leave whole. Claire's silence became more terrifying than any outburst of rage could have been. After discovering the affair and the pregnancy, she slipped into a quiet that unsettled both Ethan and Evelyn. She moved through the house with an eerie calmness, never raising her voice, never showing visible anger, but behind her eyes there was something cold and unreadable. Ethan, desperate to salvage what he could, convinced himself that her silence meant acceptance. He told himself that, with time, she might forgive him, that perhaps the storm had passed. Evelyn, though weighed down by guilt, clung to the same fragile hope. They both underestimated her. Claire wasn't forgiving them. She was waiting, watching, and carefully shaping a plan that neither of them could see coming. Nights were the hardest for Claire. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it was shallow and restless. She lay awake in the dark, her mind consumed by images of betrayal. She pictured her mother and husband together, their whispers, their hidden touches, the lies told under her own roof. Each thought sharpened her hatred, each memory fanned the flames of her resolve. She began to view forgiveness and escape as weak options, undeserving of the pain she had suffered. Divorce or separation wouldn't erase the humiliation. The only justice she saw was to ensure they paid with more than their reputations, more than their relationships. They had taken everything from her, and in her mind, there was only one way to balance the scales. Her behavior became meticulous. She watched Ethan closely, memorizing his routines, his comings and goings, the way he moved around the house. She did the same with Evelyn, noting the times she stayed in her room, the times she left for errands, the patterns in her day. Every detail mattered to Claire because she wasn't going to act recklessly. She wanted precision, certainty. She wanted her plan to be flawless. Outwardly, Claire began to play a role, disguising her intentions. She spoke more gently to Ethan, asking about his work, pretending to show interest in his business again. She feigned small signs of reconciliation, enough to ease his paranoia and make him believe she was softening. To Evelyn, she presented a mask of distance but not outright hostility, maintaining the illusion that she was slowly adjusting to the situation. This performance gave her the freedom to prepare without raising suspicion. Behind closed doors, Claire's thoughts grew darker. She imagined scenarios in vivid detail, testing them in her mind. She envisioned poisoning their food, but the lack of certainty about the outcome left her unsatisfied. She thought about orchestrating an accident, but accidents left too much to chance. What she craved was control, the certainty of knowing she was the one who ended their lives with her own hands. Her fantasies became plans, and those plans began to take shape with chilling clarity. Ethan remained blinded by denial. He believed that the worst had already passed. In his mind, the affair was a mistake that would slowly fade with time, that he could eventually rebuild his marriage and carry on with his life. Evelyn, heavily pregnant, had grown resigned to the reality of her situation, focusing on the child rather than the damage she had caused. Neither of them realized that Claire's silence was not a sign of surrender, but a mask concealing her preparation for the final betrayal. The tension in the house grew unbearable, though it remained unspoken. Every glance Claire gave Ethan and Evelyn carried a weight they could not interpret, but they pushed their discomfort aside, desperate to pretend life was normal. The meals they shared together were filled with an emptiness that none of them acknowledged, as if speaking of the truth would shatter the fragile illusion holding them together. Claire's transformation deepened. She no longer thought of herself as a victim. She thought of herself as an executioner, someone chosen to deliver punishment that no court or law could ever provide. The betrayal had been personal, intimate, and so her justice would be the same. She began preparing the tools she would need, not weapons in the traditional sense, but ordinary household items she could repurpose. She tested their weight, their sharpness, their effectiveness, all in secret. The knowledge of what she was preparing gave her a sense of power she had lost when she first discovered the affair. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt in control. As the weeks passed, Ethan noticed her change but misinterpreted it. He thought she was finally healing, that the quiet was a sign of progress. He allowed himself to believe they might still have a future together, blind to the danger he was walking into. Evelyn sensed the distance, but her guilt clouded her judgment. She told herself that Claire's coldness was a natural response, that with the arrival of the baby, perhaps wounds might eventually begin to close. Neither of them saw that Claire's distance was not about healing, it was about waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every day brought Claire closer to her decision. Her resolve hardened with every reminder of their betrayal. The sight of Evelyn's growing stomach filled her with rage, so strong she could barely keep her composure. The sound of Ethan's voice made her skin crawl, every word he spoke echoing in her mind as lies. She rehearsed her plan over and over until it became second nature. She knew exactly when and how she would act, and nothing would stop her once the time came. On the night she chose, she set everything in motion with chilling precision. She created an atmosphere of calm, giving Ethan the impression that she was finally ready to talk. Her voice was steady, her demeanor almost warm, a performance so convincing that Ethan let his guard down completely. Evelyn, exhausted and unsuspecting, never imagined what her daughter was capable of. They were both lulled into a false sense of security, unaware that Claire's mask concealed a storm that was about to break. Her plan was not driven by impulse but by weeks of careful preparation. She had chosen the moment, the place, and the method, ensuring that when she struck, there would be no escape for either of them. Claire's silence had not been weakness, it had been the sharpening of her blade. And when the time came, she would unleash everything she had bottled inside, leaving behind not just broken trust but broken lives. The betrayal had set the stage, but Claire's vengeance would deliver the final act. The walls of the house that once held love and trust were about to witness something far darker. The trap was ready, the roles were set, and only Claire knew the ending that awaited them. The night Claire had been waiting for arrived with an unsettling calm. The air inside the house felt heavy, as if the walls themselves sensed what was about to unfold. Ethan returned home later than usual, weary from work, and found Claire unusually composed. She greeted him with a softness he had not seen in months, her tone free of hostility, her face marked with a strange serenity. To Ethan, it was a sign that perhaps their fractured life was beginning to mend. To Claire, it was the mask she had perfected, the final piece of her deception falling into place. Evelyn was upstairs, resting, her pregnancy now unmistakable, her presence in the house a daily reminder of betrayal. She too believed that Claire's calmness meant acceptance, though her unease lingered beneath the surface. Neither of them suspected that this night would end in blood. Claire had prepared meticulously. Every detail had been rehearsed in her mind until it felt inevitable. She had chosen the kitchen as the stage, a place ordinary and unassuming where tools of daily life could easily become weapons. She served dinner with deliberate care, her movements steady, her eyes betraying nothing. Ethan ate in silence, relieved by the absence of confrontation. Evelyn, moving slowly under the weight of her condition, joined them at the table. The three of them sat together like a family, though the bond was hollow, the air charged with tension only Claire fully understood. As they finished the meal, Claire's heart pounded, though her face remained calm. She cleared the dishes, moving with a precision that masked her true intent. When she returned, she carried not plates but the objects she had chosen. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted. Ethan looked up, confusion flickering in his eyes, but by then it was too late. Claire's silence broke, not with words but with action. The first strike landed before either of them could react, and the calm that had lulled them into security shattered in an instant. Ethan's shock was palpable. He stumbled back, his face twisted in disbelief as the reality of what was happening hit him. He tried to defend himself, but Claire's fury had been building for too long, and she unleashed it with unstoppable force. Each movement was deliberate, fueled by months of suppressed rage. Evelyn screamed, attempting to intervene, but the weight of her pregnancy slowed her. She became the second target of Claire's wrath, her pleas silenced by the same merciless determination. The kitchen became a scene of chaos. The sound of struggle echoed through the house, mixed with the sharp, brutal finality of violence. Ethan's resistance weakened under the relentless assault, his strength no match for the sheer force of Claire's anger. Evelyn's cries faded into silence as Claire turned on her with equal vengeance, erasing the life that had betrayed her and the unborn child that symbolized everything she had lost. When it was over, the stillness returned, but it was no longer the calm of a family meal. It was the silence of death. Claire stood over them, her chest heaving, her hands stained with the weight of what she had done. For the first time since the betrayal had been revealed, she felt a sense of control, a twisted satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Her husband and her mother had taken everything from her, but in that moment she had taken everything from them. The child that had been conceived in secrecy and shame would never be born. The family that had been destroyed by betrayal was now obliterated by her vengeance. The aftermath was grim. Neighbors later recalled hearing strange noises but dismissing them as ordinary household commotion. It was not until hours later that the silence of the house raised a suspicion. When authorities arrived, they were confronted with a scene so disturbing that even seasoned investigators were shaken. The bodies of Ethan and Evelyn lay where Claire had left them, the evidence of violence clear and brutal. The story that unfolded stunned the community, a tale of betrayal and vengeance that seemed almost unimaginable. Claire did not flee. When the police entered, they found her sitting calmly in the living room, her expression unreadable, as if she had already accepted the fate that awaited her. She offered no resistance, no excuses. To her, the act was complete, the justice delivered. She was led away in silence, the same silence that had concealed her plan for so long, now carrying her into the consequences of her actions. The investigation revealed the full extent of the scandal. The affair between Ethan and Evelyn, the pregnancy, the lies woven within the walls of the house all came to light. The community, once admiring the family as stable and respectable, was left reeling. Headlines captured the shocking details, spreading the story far beyond the quiet neighborhood. The betrayal of a wife by her husband and her mother, and the violent revenge that followed, became a tale people whispered about with equal parts horror and fascination. At trial, Claire's demeanor remained composed. Prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded killer, while her defense tried to argue that the betrayal had pushed her beyond reason. Witnesses testified about the seemingly perfect family image, now revealed as nothing but a facade hiding dark secrets. The pregnancy, a symbol of the ultimate betrayal, became central to the case, underscoring the depth of Claire's humiliation and rage. The jury, faced with the chilling details, found little room for sympathy. The verdict was swift, and Claire was sentenced, her life behind bars sealing the final chapter of the tragedy. Yet for many, the story did not end there. It became a grim reminder of how secrets and desires, when left unchecked, could spiral into destruction. The affair had begun with glances, conversations, and stolen moments, but it had grown into something none of them could control. Evelyn had sought validation, Ethan had sought passion, and together they had betrayed the person who trusted them most. In the end, their choices led not to love or happiness but to death. For Claire, the betrayal had stripped her of everything she knew, her marriage, her family, her sense of self. In her eyes, she had reclaimed power through vengeance, but the cost was ultimate. She lost her freedom, her future, and whatever humanity remained in her. The house where the tragedy unfolded was eventually sold, but its history lingered, a shadow that could not be erased. Neighbors avoided speaking of it, though whispers continued, passing the story like a cautionary tale. The case left a scar not only on the people involved, but on everyone who heard it. It revealed the darkness that could exist within ordinary lives, the way passion and secrecy could ignite into tragedy. It was not simply a story of infidelity, but of betrayal layered so deeply that it tore a family apart in the most violent way possible. And at its core was a reminder that trust, once broken, can transform love into hatred and betrayal into murder.